but it seems to be working fine now.
Okay.
So,
Perfect.
yeah, over to you.
Okay. So just wanted to go over a few house rules before we start our session. Since today it is primarily an interactive session, please feel free to turn on your video or audio and ask the question in person. We'd love to hear you as well, not just see your questions. And if your question is directed towards a particular speaker, please mention that. If not, one of our speakers will pick up whoever feels that they have an answer for the question that you ask. Please remember that there are absolutely no dumb questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and we're happy to answer even the most basic questions you might have. So whoever would like to start, please turn on your audio and start. And please remember, if someone's already speaking, refrain from turning on your audio or video and interjecting with someone else's thought process. Thank you.
Well, at the same time, if anybody just wants to type out your question on chat, it's fine as well.
Yeah. So Pooja Sampath has a long question. I'm a little confused about polyps as cnidarians. Are all polyps that form hard and soft corals cnidarians? I read that polyps form corals and cnidarians are a group of animals known for their stinging capabilities. So does that mean that all soft and hard corals have the ability to sting? Abhishek, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So cnidarians are quite a broad phylum of animals, and they were defined by the presence of stinging cells. They don't necessarily have to be polyps. For example, jellyfish are not polyps, but they do have stinging cells. But all hard and soft corals do, as a typical feature, they do have stinging cells. Some of them that do not sting, maybe like that would be then a secondary adaptation where they would have lost stinging cells because they don't need it in their specific environment for particular species. But that is what we call an adaptive radiation, which is, you branch off from what is the norm for your family, depending on the environment you live in. But your roots are still in the stinging cell lineage. So yeah. So just let me just read your question again. Are all polyps that form hard and soft corals cnidarians? Yes, they are. Does that mean all soft and hard corals have the ability to sting? So like I said, some may not. I do not know the answer to this, whether all of them do or no. But in case there are some that do not, that would be a secondary adaptation. So yes, they're all cnidarians.
Thanks, Abhishek. I think that, Pooja, I hope that answers your question. If you do have any more clarifications, feel free to turn on your mic and ask us as well. Or you can just put it on on the chat box on the side. We have a question from Nikhil Savant, which is to everyone. And he says, hi, is there any book or database to identify seaweed species taxonomically? I think this is an open question to pretty much everybody because I don't know if any one person would have an answer to this.
I'm not aware of any online database as such for seaweeds as such, but there are quite a few textbooks, and unlikely that there might be PDF versions of it. Maybe smaller handbooks for the common species, but not something that you could use for a very broad study. Abhishek?
So like Murli guessed, the answer would be quite vague here. I do know of some herbarium PDFs that are available from the CMFRI library. You can find them for free. And there is one ebook called Seaweeds of Gujarat, which I forget who wrote it, but like one of these Indian institutes came out with it. And those are very narrow, as you would guess from the names. The herbarium has very few species in it, and the seaweeds of Gujarat is obviously just Gujarat. But I have found them quite useful to get some sort of idea from where you can then use that as a launchpad to do more ID. And there is one online database called AlgaeBase, but not ideal for identification. That's more of a taxonomic database.
Okay, awesome. I think that answers that question perfectly well. We do have a question again from, I believe, Praveen, if I'm not mistaken, who wants.
Suneha, you muted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we have a question from Praveen M, where he says, we read about keystone species. What are examples of keystone species in various coastal ecosystems around India? Does anyone want to particularly take that, or do I think Mudli, maybe, do you want to take that question?
No, I think anybody can answer this. Like, why Trisha?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a few examples, and I'm sure we could all pitch in with examples from different systems and species we work in. But generally, yeah, keystone species tend to be the species that really define an ecosystem or can play a large role in controlling how the ecosystem sort of plays out. And in many cases, a keystone species usually is a top predator. So sharks are definitely a good example of keystone species in many marine ecosystems, if not most, because especially your larger top predator sharks are the ones who, through top-down effects, do kind of control how energy flows through the ecosystem. So if a shark disappears, there are a lot of different changes that happen across the food web and across the ecosystem. So there would be one good example of keystone species. So examples of shark species that could be good keystone species would be species like the hammerheads, bull sharks, and many others actually. So yeah, that's my
Thanks. Thanks, Trisha. That's actually super useful to know. Abhishek, do you have any idea about keystone species in coastal ecosystems as well?
Only vague personal observations. I haven't read much about it, but the example given in the coursework is the sea urchins on the Pacific coast, and we do see sea urchin explosions like that on the Indian intertidal zones as well, and that it sort of manifests in a very similar way to that textbook example from the Pacific, where you have algae going completely bust and you have sea urchins littering all over the place. Now we don't have sea otters here, which are there in those ecosystems, but I know that we do have certain fish that venture into the intertidal and specialize in crunching up the sea urchin shells and eating their insides. For example, parrotfish are one of the fish that can do that in some cases. There are some tetraodont fishes, like some certain puffer fishes, that are also possibly doing that, and maybe it's removal of that is causing it. But this is complete guesswork from my side. I haven't studied this and I haven't read about it.
Alyssa, do you have any input on this as well?
No, I mean, I was going to give the example that Abhishek just gave of the otters and the sea urchins. So keystone essentially means that having a species, the presence or absence of that species that can have quite a massive effect on things that it depends on or things that depend on that particular species. So that's essentially, like Trisha said, it can affect the structure. So it's a very crucial part of that system. Another term actually that is used many times in place of keystone is flagship, but it can also be misunderstood because not necessarily all flagship species are keystone species, right? So sometimes flagship species can simply be very charismatic species and that are probably important in a way of conservation in terms of attention and other factors that it includes, but it might not have a very crucial role where removal of that particular animal will have cascading effects. But example wise, I mean, like Trisha said, sharks are an amazing example for keystone species. The sea urchin example also. So usually, as far as I am aware, it's top predators that usually are part of keystone species.
Thanks, guys. I think we have all managed to answer that question pretty comprehensively.
I just need to add one thing. Like, I would say everybody start by reading the original description by Payne on the disaster and the muscles. It all depends on scale when you're talking about keystone species, when you're looking at a trophic system. We've talked about top predators at a much larger scale when we're talking about sharks, but these can also be for much smaller systems as described by Robert Payne in the past.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have quite a few questions actually.
Have we lost Suneha again?
Yes.
All right. I can take the next question after keystone species. Sejal Tiwari has asked about oceanic zones and explaining that a little bit more. Who wants to take this one?
Sorry, I can't see the question. Where is it?
It's in the chat window.
Yeah.
Murli, the second question is actually from Pooja. The next question.
No, I think after keystone species, Sejal has asked about oceanic zones. Pooja has asked about the difference between infaunal, meofaunal, and epifaunal organisms with examples. I think Sejal has just sent it to me as a direct message.
Yeah,
Send it to the group.
I can't see that question.
Yeah, I just noticed that.
Hi guys, I apologize for the multiple technical failures on my side. I don't know what's been happening today. But picking up from where we left off, Murli, do you think you can take some of the questions from the chat? I'm not able to view them because I just joined the
past
meeting.
Chats would have gone. Abhishek, do you want to take this thing on explaining the different oceanic zones?
Has it come up here in the public window? No, I think it's still a message to you. Can you just read it out?
Sejal just wants to know some more detail about the different oceanic zones. And I'm guessing you're talking about the benthic pelagic or zones. Do you want to expand on this, Sejal? Okay. I think you're not getting back from Sejal, but do one of you want to take this thing about the difference between infaunal, meofaunal, and epifaunal organisms with examples?
I can give my 2 cents, but please help me out with some examples because I'm not able to think of them right now. But I think the name kind of says it all for these species groups. So infaunal are usually things that are found living inside something, whether it's inside the soil, or I think it could even refer to inside another organism. Whereas epifaunal, again, as the name suggests, are organisms that are found living above or on top, like on the surface of something. So on the surface of the seafloor or slightly above it. And meofaunal is an interesting group of organisms that are not quite microscopic, but not quite macroscopic either. So they're just about visible to the naked eye, and they're just very tiny organisms that you can still somewhat see on the naked eye. So I think there's a bit more of a technical explanation in terms of the exact size category they fall under, but a simpler explanation would be in between micro and macro. As for examples, I think meofauna could include things like really tiny copepods and shrimps and Many fish larvae also come under meiofauna. I think epifauna could even include species like seaweed and polychaetes that grow or are found on the surface. But yeah, you guys have any examples to add to this?
No, basically, I think Trisha got like I got a little bit baffled by the question, but Trisha caught the trick in that. Infaunal and epifaunal are what you're asking about. Meiofaunal is something to do, it's completely different. It's something to do with size. That I saw your question and it confused me a little, but what Trisha said is right. So in Meo, you have macrofauna, meiofauna, microfauna, which are size based. And infaunal and epifaunal are based on the habitat. Infaunal being things that live inside, like burrowers, for example, and epifauna are growing on top of maybe blades of algae or growing on top of rocks, something like that.
The next question is a little interesting. Neha Mordya has asked whether in the last few years, have there been any noticeable evolutionary pattern among species living closer to cities who have perhaps evolved in a way to cope with the stress of living in such waters, intertidal zones? The two people from Mumbai, please.
I mean, this is a tough question to answer. I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but I mean, I don't know if also evolution is a very big word to use, no, because we don't have that kind of data to say evolution. So just a minute, 1 minute. Have there been any noticeable evolutionary patterns among species living close to species who have perhaps evolved in a way to cope with stress living in such waters? I don't know about intertidal zones. I think that is something that Abhishek can, maybe help you out with. But just to talk in terms of, the larger marine fauna, there is very little data to say if there is any sort of evolutionary noticeable patterns that have been there, because there have been records of marine mammals like dolphins, and there are also quite a few sharks and other bigger marine megafauna that have been recorded in Mumbai waters and along the coast of Maharashtra, and very in spaces that are very polluted, in waters that are very polluted. We don't know how these animals react to things like boat noises. At least I'm not aware. But so far, while we have seen these animals, there is not enough data at this point in time to say if there's any evolutionary change that I've heard of. There are cases in which I've heard of, like in the US, there are places where a lot of industrial runoff has caused fish to change their the sex of a particular individual. So if they are males, then certain chemicals have caused them, hormonal medication that has run off into the waters has caused them to change their sex. So in those ways, there have been adaptations and changes that have happened in places around cities. But evolutionary patterns is something that I haven't come across. So I don't think I can answer that part of your question. But the intertidal part is something that I think Abhishek can maybe add in and chip in.
Yeah. First thing I wanted to point out is the word you're looking for is probably adaptation and not evolution, because evolution is on a huge time scale. You cannot measure it in the pollution history of Mumbai. Even though that may be some 200 years or so, that's still not enough to measure evolution. So, but in terms of adaptation, even adaptation, to be honest, I can't really say I have seen creatures adapting to polluted waters. What we do see is the polluted habitat sort of selecting for more tolerant species. So you have species that have over time, over a long period of time, since long before pollution has existed, there have been some species that can tolerate, say, muddy conditions, for example, like certain corals that don't need very clear water, that can tolerate turbidity. So you have creatures like that getting selected for habitats like Mumbai. But I wouldn't say they have specifically adapted to Mumbai conditions yet, although that could happen over time, but we haven't measured it yet.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we'll stop over here, but Suneha, you want to add something?
Yeah, I also just want to quickly add that it's quite likely we'll see behavioral changes before we see active, like ecological adaptations to a lot of things that are happening due to urbanization. So we might be able to see things like changes in behavior for larger species and sometimes even smaller, but it's very hard for us at this point to empirically state that these creatures have adapted to certain conditions that cities bring about.
Yeah. So yeah, I think adding to that, like what Abhishek said, evolution works at much larger time scales. So it's very commonly replaced with the term adaptation, but at some levels we do see a lot more mutations and like even like hybridizations that's occurring between species, but I wouldn't call it an evolutionary change. There has been more cases of melanism being observed in certain species of sea snakes as well in muddier waters. But again, the scale is so small in terms of time that we don't know whether it is a heritable trait that is going to continue. And like Abhishek rightly said, we are seeing species which are already tolerant to more adverse conditions or turbid conditions seen more frequently in a wider area. The next question is from Stella, and she says, from what I understand, we know about marine animals, both from dives and probes, are also getting pulled up in fishing. If so, at what depth do fishing nets go on a regular basis? And do we know what are the deepest living creatures that have been caught in fishing nets? Abhishek, Trisha, Alyssa, go for it.
So just to 1 minute. So from what I understand, we know about marine animals both from dives and probes, but also from getting pulled up in fishing nets. Is that yes? So I mean, their fishing is quite rampant. We have a huge coastline, so there are definitely an array of species that are caught in fishing nets, especially in trawls. So the diversity is tremendous. And if so, to what depth do fishing nets go? So in my experience, commercial fishing boats that go for deep sea fishing, when I've spoken to fishermen, I've heard of them saying that they've gone fishing up to 500 to 700 meters depth. And this is along the west coast. Okay. I assume that this will change on the east coast because the water goes much deeper, much faster. So they probably go much further out. But in my knowledge, at least till 800 meters, deep sea fishing happens. And amongst that, there have been quite a few deep sea sharks actually very few deep sea sharks that have been found. But there are also very few records of, there's just very little study that has been done on landing sites, right? Like at these fishing harbors. So many a times, a lot of these deep sea fish that probably come in, they are not commercially important. So they are just thrown into trash. So many a times they are not even recorded. And I think that's where a lot of deep sea data sort of, goes into trash because we don't have that access to that information. And yeah, I think if that answers your question.
Just to also add to that, yeah, exactly as Alyssa said, in India, I think they do go to about 700-800 meters or maybe even a bit more.
Probably more, to be honest.
Probably more, yeah, 1,000, 1,200. And so you do have records of things like a few deep sea sharks or some chimeras or other strange things that they find, because especially in India, we have limited resources to do other things like dives and probes and other more technological methods to study the deep sea. So it's a really good way to actually see what's in our slightly deeper waters. But on a global level, you have boats that go fishing in the high seas at very, very deep levels sometimes. So I'm not even sure to what depths, to be honest, or what they find. But I can imagine that it will be much deeper than what Indian fishers do, especially if they go out to, say, the open ocean in the Pacific or the Atlantic, and they're fishing with long lines or even trawlers. They probably catch a lot of stuff that may have not yet even been described by science. So it's definitely an interesting question.
And also something to keep in mind, it also depends on what kind of gear you're using. You know, if you're using trawl which involves bottom trawling, then you really are scraping. You know, you really are going to great depths, especially if it is a really large steel vessel. If you're doing something where you're involved with it. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it is also very gear dependent and your boat size dependent. So all of these factors also come. But if you're talking about large fishing operations, commercial vessels, they go up to 800 at least, and I'm pretty sure it's much more than that if they go out further out into the sea. Yeah.
Abhishek, any specific observations that you've heard of, like of deeper waters, or know of any record?
Not really, except that I think this question and the answers have covered commercial fishing. I just wanted to add that deep sea trawling for research is a thing by itself. So I don't know if you meant to ask that as part of your question, but when you said what are the deepest known creatures that have been caught in fishing nets, I think some of the very deep creatures, like before submersibles and all became a thing now, before that, the deep sea research was all done by research trawling, even in India. So I just wanted to add that.
Cool. Okay, I think the next question I can answer. I'll read it as well. This is from Suman. The question on olive ridley nesting, on why in certain years you have mass nesting and why in certain years it is sporadic. Especially this year where the mass nesting, the Aribada is sporadic, but in the past years it was mass nesting. What can be the cause? There isn't any specific cause for the mass nesting to happen or not happen. I've been studying them since 2008. I still have no idea. But what I can definitely say is the Indian mass nesting population in comparison to what you see in Central and South America, we do see a fluctuating nesting that is there. So there are certain years where there are mass nesting events that occur at both the large mass nesting sites in Orissa, in Gahirmatha and Rushikulya. And there are certain years where they might miss out on one of these nesting sites. And there are definitely certain years when it happens twice also at a particular site. So at the most, what we know is that I would expect that the population that nests in Orissa is one single group which nests at both sites interchangeably. And on certain years, they nest at both sites, but on certain years, they nest only in one site. So this year, the mass nesting event did take place in Gahirmatha, didn't take place in Rushikulya. Last year, it took place both in Gahirmatha and Rushikulya, and they were really massive nesting events. 2 years back, there was no nesting. 3 years back, there was heavy nesting. So we do know that there is some sort of overall pattern in nesting numbers and intensity of nesting that happens. And we feel that it's a part of that normal phenomena as well, of mass nesting not occurring. So there is no cause behind it, or there is no way that you could make a mass nesting occur as well. So I think it's just part of a normal reproductive cycle. Again, this is something that I know looking at it at a broader scale as well, not just this year, last year, and 2 years back. If you look at how nesting has happened over several years, we know that certain years nesting numbers are low. it could potentially be associated with warming waters, El Nino events, cyclone events that happen, but there isn't one specific reason why it will happen or won't happen or in what intensity. Anybody else wants to add anything? Like, why do like turtles aggregate or any species aggregate in certain years and don't in other years?
I think since we have a lot of questions, I think Murli, you've explained that like really well. So maybe we can move on to the next few questions that we have from the audience. Does that work? Yeah.
Yeah. So next is from Maria, who's doing her BSc in zoology, environmental science and chemistry. How can I make a career in marine biology from here? Which universities in India would you recommend for an MSc in marine biology? And finally, she's read that the sex of sea turtles are temperature dependent. Could you elaborate and what exactly happens? Good career in marine biology. I think all of us have jobs who are sitting on this panel. We've tried multiple things, so it's not so bad. There are multiple avenues that you can look at. Universities that you could recommend for marine biology. I didn't do marine biology. I studied wildlife biology. So did Alyssa.
I also did wildlife
I
biology.
didn't. Yeah, I did tropical biology. You don't. I think it's important to note that if you are interested in marine biology, you can study an allied subject. Like you can study chemistry and still get into the field of marine conservation. You can study wildlife biology, zoology, botany, and still get in. You don't need that particular degree of MSc marine biology or PhD in something to be calling yourself a marine biologist. So I think that's very important to note. There's a lot of good universities in India. There's NCBS, which has a great wildlife biology and conservation program. There's Wildlife Institute of India, where Murli studied, which also has a great wildlife biology program. There is Pondicherry University. They have ecology in their Pondicherry campus, as well as an MSc Marine Biology itself in their Andaman and Nicobar campus. So these are some of the very, very well-known options for getting into this field.
We have Abhishek from Karnataka University also. There are lots of places which offer marine biology as well. There's marine biology, there's oceanography. Yeah, Annamala University.
There's Goa University, which has marine science as their course. I think the idea is the concepts still remain the same largely, right? In ecology, when we talk about ecology, when we say marine ecology, terrestrial ecology, that's sort of like a specialization, but the overall concepts remain the same, right? You're working in different systems, and the problems or the other things that come with the system, that's something that can be handled, of course. But at least for me personally, if I had to say, for me, just volunteering, for projects really helped. Like getting in touch with people who I have heard of, either through my seniors or if I've read papers, and if I know of people who are working in India, like this is a great platform, right, for you to get to know of different people's projects and what they're working on, and just work with them, volunteer with them, intern with them. I think that really helps, because for me personally that helps, because that's the kind of person I am when it comes to learning. I learn a lot more on a job as opposed to doing theory work. So yeah, I guess like volunteering as much as you can for projects really also helps. And in terms of careers, I think it depends on. Today, there are a lot of avenues as to where you can go. You can go into science communication. You can go into and that itself is a huge. You can communicate science through art, through writing, through dance, through a lot of things, right? And then you have academia, where you go into research and you will be a scientist at some point in time with your PhD. So it really depends on what your interests are. Today, there are a lot of avenues. Like there are people who are not doing their PhDs, but they are just field biologists, right? So that's also one career path that you can take. And today there are ample avenues, I would say, as there were even 5 to 10 years ago, right? it's also a very new field, right? I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the others, but it's a fairly new field, you know, marine biology and like wildlife biology in general. I mean, it's now that I think over the past 5 years that people are really starting to know what wildlife biology entails and what marine biology entails and what are the job prospects like and what's the scope. So it's still coming up, and I think the advantage of that is that you can, you know, sort of create, if I can say, create jobs as well, like, you know, different kinds of avenues in which you can go into.
And to add to Alyssa's point, I just want to say that if you're working in the field of ecology and conservation, there's a lot of industries which sort of tend to employ you. It's not only academia or, you know, people, a lot of us also work with NGOs. So that is one path. Academia is one path. Working in NGOs and non-profit organizations is another path. You can also choose to work alongside tourism industries. You can choose to either become a dive instructor, or you can choose to work alongside dive instructors, you know, whether it's for research or marine education. So there's a lot, especially because it's such a young field and a new field. I think it's a great opportunity and it's a great time to get into this field in India, because we can pretty much make the path as we're going. And I think that also answers another question among here, where Shaheen Shahajan has asked, after MSc, which is a better option, PhD or going into project in NGOs? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, other people on this panel, but I think that's really a personal decision. I know people who've straight away gone for their PhDs and been very, very happy with that decision. And I know people who've taken their time, spent a few years working in an NGO or in a research organization, and then chosen to go for their PhD. I think a lot of it also depends on how clear you are in your research goals. If you are finished with your MSc, you already know what you want to continue your research on, then you can totally go for your PhD. You know, whereas if that's not the case, then maybe spend some time, get some experience, and then you'll have a better idea.
I think also, just to add to that, Suneha, is that this thing of, I think we are all, this field does not have that same sort of, you know, ladder that we are used to or that we are brought up with, right? Like that, finish your BSc, then you do your master's, then you do your PhD, then you do this. So somehow this field doesn't really have that. It really comes down to your own personal decision, because doing a PhD or a postdoc is not something that, it is in no way like a hierarchy of sorts that you need to complete that you would have in a corporate job, right? Where you go up the ladder. Of course you will, if you have a PhD, it does add to your career, but that's if you want it to go that way. Yeah, so it's not the usual, the career paths in this and the direction in which you go is not in a similar way as to how you would do in a corporate situation, or like the usual way in which our society is used to it.
Can I add a little to this?
Yeah.
Should we move on?
So, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to add, because there's something interesting that was said with regards to even diving, that Suneha said. Now, as a diver, you do tend to meet a lot of people who are in the research field, and because of which it gives you a better understanding of, like, 9 years ago when I started diving, is because I wanted to do my MSc in marine biology, but only after living in the kind of environment that I'm living in, I realized that what I want to do now is very, very different. So working with NGOs or working with different independent researchers or research facilities, it gives you a better understanding, or just even living in an environment gives you a better understanding of what it is that you want to do. There is too much importance put on a degree, whereas you can make a lot of difference by just understanding how ecosystems and people in that ecosystem live. And that itself can add value to whatever it is that you want to do as far as conservation is concerned, or studying further is concerned, or picking up a subject is concerned.
Let me just add 2 lines. I'm not going. I know we need to rush, but since everyone has spoken from the ecology and conservation angle, I just wanted to add one thing. So I did my master's in marine biology from Karnataka University, which is sort of like an underdog university, if you want to call it that. I just wanted to add that there are two fundamental differences between a course like NCBS and the kind of course I did. NCBS is basically something that teaches you the tools and the concepts to do whatever you want to do in any kind of ecosystem. You can apply that to marine if you're interested in marine. But the course I did was super broad. It covered everything right from marine microbiology to fisheries biology to fisheries economics to marine biology and things like that. And when I took the course that I did, I knew I was interested in marine, but I was clueless about what I want to do within marine. And at that point, a course like NCBS would not have helped me. So there are these two fundamental differences between these two kinds of courses. And if you have more questions about that, I think I'll answer later. You can email me or something.
Actually, great point, Abhishek, because that one thing I'd really like to say, it doesn't really matter where you've done your education or what course you have done. You really can put in your inputs. It depends on which sector again you're getting into, whether you're getting into research, education, like active conservation. You put in all the inputs that you can get. We've got people from the arts, people from engineering, we've got veterinary doctors. It's a very diverse team of people who work together in this sector. So there is opportunity for multiple things. I'm just going to take the last bit of the questions really fast. Sex of sea turtles are determined during incubation in the third trimester, basically, like in olive Ridley's in the third week. So warmer temperatures will give rise to males. Will give rise to females, and cooler temperatures will give rise to males. If the reverse is seen in crocodiles. How this occurs is basically there is some level of heat-sensitive proteins that are there which get released during the incubation phase, which causes a gender switch to occur during that phase of development. And that the temperatures that are maintained during that phase of growth determines it. So I can give a little bit more detail about specifics. I've been doing work on this for a while now. So yeah, you can get in touch with me for more specific question. Next, Tanvi has asked that we've learned that mangrove, seagrass, and coral reefs are linked, and removal of mangroves have had a huge impact on other systems. My question is, in the case of Mumbai mangroves, what ecosystem, natural and fishing communities have been affected, and how by the removal of mangroves? Abhishek, Alyssa.
Where are you? Which question is this?
This is by Tanvi.
Universities one, just below that one. So actually, I wish we had some mangrove person on the panel to answer this. Okay, I'll try to answer it to the best of my knowledge. I'm not at all a specialist in mangroves, but
I will not answer this question.
Okay. So your question is pertaining to Mumbai, you said. So Mumbai, as you know, has mangroves in many parts of Mumbai. It's like a network of rivers that has now been filled in and all that. So there are these traditional fishing communities that have always relied on mangroves. They fish only in the mangroves, and you find these in all these pockets all over Mumbai. And those are the livelihoods that do get affected when something happens to the mangroves. But that's more of something that you can find in general reading. And there's one thing I wanted to point out that is really interesting that I learned about very recently from one of my friends who is a mangrove botanist. He told me there is this thing happening specifically in the case of Mumbai. I don't know if it's happening elsewhere, where the city, because it carries, so the city gets flooded year after year, and there's also always a load of plastic and other solid waste, which is much more than most other places in the rivers. And this is depositing near the river mouths, and it's sort of creating land which gets taken over by mangroves. So the mangroves are actually expanding into places where they shouldn't naturally be, near the river mouth. And there have been some cases where this unnatural mangrove expansion is clogging the rivers further, and it's affecting the upstream ecosystems from there. Because the more mangroves expand near the river mouths, because of all the heavy siltation and solid waste, there's more and more siltation and plastic getting trapped there, and water levels rising upstream in the where the rivers are coming from. And that's an ecosystem that's getting affected that doesn't usually get, we don't usually think of that when we're thinking of mangroves affecting an ecosystem. I just wanted to point that out. Anyone else able to answer this in a more general mangrove sense, please?
No, so one other thing that we've generally seen is post the tsunami in early 2000s, there's been a massive drive for mangrove plantation all across the Indian coast. In many cases, like Abhishek mentioned, they've been planted in places where they haven't existed in the past as well. This has not necessarily always been a good thing, both for the communities living in those areas, because once a mangrove gets established, it is a protected forest of sorts. They cannot be harvested. There's a lot of associated changes that happens to the region that they are in. And they have been moving further upstream, which also indicates change in salinity levels and things like that. So it's not a very simple answer, I would say, like how many of the simple textbook examples that are given are like at very different scales. So we have no idea like what is going to happen by the removal of a large chunk of mangroves of Mumbai. We might not see the impacts of it immediately. We might see it much later. Cool. Moving on, we have 2 questions on sea turtles. If you guys don't mind, I'll take that quickly. One is, do city lights hamper the hatching of sea turtles, like when they're swimming back to the sea? And that is by Maria. And Supriya has asked about how deforestation can affect turtle nesting. That's an extremely interesting question. But yes, city lights do hamper the sea finding of sea turtle hatchlings, because as soon as they're born, they're attracted towards lights. So any lights close to the nesting beach can distract the sea turtle hatchlings. They can get distracted when they're in the water as well, if there are really strong sources of light, if they're still pretty close to the shore. So it is a huge issue. How deforestation affects sea turtle nesting. There is some interesting work that has talked about many sea turtle species nesting beaches, especially olive ridleys and leatherbacks, are found close to estuaries and the beaches that are formed next to estuaries. These are extremely dynamic in nature and are heavily dependent on the nutrient load which comes out from the estuaries as well, from the rivers. Excessive logging can release high amounts of sediment load, which can get washed down onto nesting beaches. Damming and waterlogging can also have effects. So these are like multi-scaled ecosystem changes that you're going to see. It's not very direct. You won't be able to observe it immediately, but you might be able to observe it in some years down the line. I hope that answered your question, but yeah. Next, we have a question from Riddhi. She's asked whether there are any vast differences between the chemical compositions of deep sea corals and those near the surface, and if so, how does it impact the ecosystem around them? And also, are they being bleached at the same rates?
Murli, can you just repeat that question? Or maybe I'll just try and find it here.
The man has not come.
Can the participants please mute? There's
nothing open, bro.
Yes, please. I think the username is Gavin. Mr. Gavin, do you mind muting yourself? Yes, thank you.
The question is from Riddhi, and she's asked whether there are any vast differences between the chemical compositions of deep sea corals and the ones near the surface. And if so, how does it impact the ecosystem around them, and whether they are being bleached at the same rate?
So I think I have a small snippet of an answer, maybe not a detailed one for this. I'm not aware of any chemical differences in chemical composition between shallow and deep corals. I'm sure there might be something, but I'm not aware of it, so I can't comment on it. But there have been some papers that do state that deep sea corals are more resistant, are expected to be more resistant to bleaching simply because of the fact that they are also experiencing a differences in temperature that shallow corals might not be experiencing. But they're known to be, some species, and correct me if I'm wrong, Abhishek and others, but some species of deep sea coral are known to be a little more resistant to and resilient to climate change and bleaching than shallow corals, right? Because of the fact that they are currently living in still warmer temperatures that they were, and they are not being bleached at as high rates as corals found in very shallow sites. But whether it's a chemical difference or not, I don't think I have an answer to that. But they are known to be a little more resilient, yes. Abhishek, do you want to add anything based on your experience?
Nothing specific. I'm just wondering if by chemical compositions, Riddhi meant are there different zooxanthellae in different corals, because the second part of the question is bleaching. So in case you are asking that, I don't know actually what drives the zooxanthellae choice in different corals, but there's a huge variety of difference in, like, even within the same genus, you'll have two very closely related species that have different zooxanthellae within them. So in case you were asking about that. And I just had one small observation, personal observation to add, that I was part of an expedition that surveyed Angria Bank in 2019, which is like on an average, like if you look at the depth of the entire bank as a whole, it's I think deeper than most other Indian coral reefs. And we did notice that the whole place is much, much healthier in terms of bleaching. Even we had species of corals that are there at several other Indian reefs, but they appeared a lot healthier at Angria Bank. So I think that could be an observation that indicates that deeper ones are more resilient. And the reason would be probably what Suneha said, that since they're deeper, they don't experience as much temperature fluctuation as shallow water corals.
All right. We are going to take another 10 minutes only, I would guess, because of the glitches in the start and everything. We don't want to keep our other speakers for much longer. But I have saved all the questions as well, and we can get back to you with certain responses like after the meeting as well. So anything else, Neha?
Yeah, we'll. I just wanted to add, we'll answer the rest of the questions that we're not able to answer over the panel. We'll email you guys the answers. We'll discuss it amongst ourselves as much as we can, and we can email you the answer.
There is one question that I'd like to take because it's the easiest one and it's the one that's just come in.
Yeah, go ahead.
By Yash. Also, which are the best organizations in India to get a diving certification from? I have dived a couple of times before, but they're all recreational. If you're asking about courses, you have a bunch of amazing dive centers across the east, west coast of India and the Andamans. Diving currently anywhere in the world is recreational. You do have technical diving, but that's again not to do with research. However, if you do get certified, you have various programs by various NGOs in India and across the world where you can help researchers collect data for their scientific work. So you do have organizations and dive centers in India that work with researchers or have a research, a research outlet where they hire or they work in tandem with researchers to see how they can make a difference to their local ecosystems. So go Google,
And
you will find plenty of dive centers that are doing these things.
So to add to what Mariam is saying, for people out here on this panel who are attending this session today, people who are interested, who've been asking us questions about volunteering with Dakshin and interning with various conservation organizations, we will soon in 2021, hopefully COVID allowing, be rolling out a program called Reflog as well, which will involve certified divers who will be, like how Mariam described, who will be working in tandem with dive centers as well as researchers from the scientific community in India in order to help us collect data on various aspects of reef health. This program is called Reflog, and we will be updating you guys sooner rather than later about the developments of this program and places where you can volunteer and help out in this program as well.
Yeah, the other thing that for most people, there is a mailing list that is managed by the Young Ecologists Talk and Interact called YETI. Opportunities on volunteering job openings are frequently posted over there. It's a very wide network of people. You can post opportunities about that as well. So you can check meetyeti.net to join that mailing list as well. People have asked whether we can share our email IDs. Yes, I'm okay with sharing my email ID.
Me too.
And yeah, we'll just collate all of it and send it as a document to the people who have participated. Next, we have a question from Mrigank, who said, considering the loss of ecology we are witnessing throughout the country, are we seeing some behavioral changes in marine plants and animals, especially in major aquatic linkages? Are also any loss of species considering linkages are connecting spaces? Also, since temperatures are rising, global warming is undeniable. There are some studies which show rise in dermatological diseases and cancers in humans. Is there anything similar seen in fishes? Murli mentioned some mechanism seen in cichlids. So do you want to talk a little bit about this, guys?
I think I can answer the second part of your question, where you're talking about dermatological diseases. So there have been a few records of sharks showing, where we don't know if they're anomalies, where they've shown cancers, they've also shown change in melanism patterns, but we don't know if that is attributed to global warming, right? Or any other factor, physiological, if it's related to toxicology. We are not aware of that. There are also other things that have been happening. There is, like I had mentioned earlier about, sex change. Sex change has also been seen in sharks, in rays, in a lot of other fish. For fish, especially certain freshwater fish, we can say that those are because of toxic waste that are going into the water. But at least for sharks and rays, it's so difficult to say that we can attribute that to global warming or climate change. And I mean, Trisha, if she'd like, she can, add to that. But in terms of sharks of ray, this is what I am aware of. Like, there have been records, but it's only been termed as, an anomaly. And the reasons behind it are very vague as of now. And it's basically just guesswork based on what information we have and just some speculation. But to say that it is specifically to global warming or to, pollution or any other reasons, one would have to have long-term data because, many of these species are long-lived. So they would require a huge chunk of data. Trisha, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. Actually, I don't have anything more to add in terms of the sharks and rays because I think you've said it all. But I do have one slightly different point and a bit of an answer to the first part of the question about just general changes in aquatic systems. So one of the things that I've noticed personally and also heard from colleagues working on this is that we've been seeing an increasing occurrence of jellyfish blooms, which can be possibly linked to global warming, though again, as Alyssa said, it's very hard to really know the causes behind these things without lot of long-term data and monitoring. But it does seem that jellyfish, being a particularly resistant species, and they generally do have a tendency to sort of boom and expand and then again go bust. So that is their natural cycle. But this cycle has been increasing over the last few decades, and it could be because of global warming and increasing temperatures or even increasing marine pollution. And these are one of those things that can have cascading effects again on your ecosystem, because when a jellyfish blooms, it's like it can be like in quite large numbers and can have a lot of impacts on the other marine species that are found on the ocean surface. So those are some of the changes that we are seeing in coastal ecosystems, but it's hard to tell their causes, or whether it's even is an unnatural phenomenon or is it just part of the natural cycles is still something that we don't really know yet.
I hope that answers your question, Mrigank. Also, hi. I think we can go to the next question.
Yeah, we'll go. We'll take as many as we can.
Yeah. I had read an article about marine fish. That fish will be extinct by 2045 due to commercial exploitation. There's also the Seaspiracy documentary, which says that not to eat fish. Is there any other way to sustainably conserve fish? Even phytoplankton levels are decreasing due to sea temperature. It will ultimately lead to the entire ecosystem from top to bottom. What is the way we can do something towards that, and does it lead to any adaptive condition to the other species? So the first question I think I understood, but I mean I don't know. I'm not too sure if I understand the last question where you're talking about.
Sorry to cut you off, Alyssa. Sejal Tiwari, could you please mute your mic? Thank you. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, so the second part of your question, Shaheen, I don't think I've gotten. But so there are a lot of things that you can do. I mean, I personally think that you don't really need to stop eating fish. You can be wise about your choices. Today there are, there are resources which tell you which months of the year are a good time for you to consume certain fish because they are not breeding during that time. And these are initiatives like Know Your Fish and In Season Fish, which give you a very good idea to be a responsible consumer. You can advocate for it and try and bring change in policy. Involve yourself in policy making, in volunteering. I think the Seaspiracy documentary will be a whole nother.
We need a different panel discussion for that.
Yeah, so I think that conversation will keep going on. But if I had to say, I mean, what you can do in a small way is just be mindful about the fish that you eat and in which months you eat it, and know where your fish is coming from. You know, it's always good to, just in terms of health wise also, it's good to know where your fish is coming from so that you know it's a clean source. Yeah. Does anybody else want to add anything to this?
If you live in mainland, not near the sea, don't eat fish. That's sustainable. So I've been wondering when a question related to Seaspiracy would come up, because there's a lot of controversy around it. Correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but that I haven't seen it myself, but it purely deals with commercial fishing outside of India and in the Western world.
Yes. So I think that's a great point, actually, Mariam, because but it's also work that's in the high seas, no? So they are very much probably, fishing around our waters, not in our territorial waters, but they are probably fishing outside of that, right? There have been a lot of records where fishermen have said that, there are boats from Taiwan and from China and from all of these places that come and fish in our waters, and we don't have any fish because of that, right? Like I've spoken to fishermen who've said that in Lakshadweep, in the Andaman Islands, in mainland as well, in Gujarat, Maharashtra, Orissa, right? So that definitely happens. One must also consider that India is very diverse in its fishing, right? Although we have a dominant kind of gear, which is trawls, that happens mostly along our coast, but we have a range of other fish. So it's not that all fishing communities that are present along our coast are commercial fishers, right? And it's way more complicated than what Seaspiracy has made it to be. But one must also acknowledge the fact that they have put out a few very, a few questions that people in science have been talking about for a really long time. So in that way, I guess it's a good thing. But also to remember that every nation and every country and every region has very specific kinds of fishing practices that are very unique and diverse to their own space. And policy, laws, all of that need to be taken into consideration. Sorry, all of the diversity needs to be taken into consideration when you're creating management policies and laws.
I think we'll end with this, but we'll just take each person's opinion about this. So, Abhishek, do you have anything to say with regards to that statement that overfishing is going to cause all the fish in the water to disappear by 2045, and what solution would you choose according to that? I'm just simplifying the question to that.
I kind of agree with what Suneha said, that this is a panel discussion by itself, this one question. And I don't remember who asked that, but you might be interested in knowing that Hakai magazine actually did a panel discussion on that, and it's up on YouTube. You can watch that if you're interested. In the end, I would say there's a lot of, in popular opinion, saving the seas always gets boiled down to stop eating fish or avoid overfishing. Whereas it's a lot more than that. There's really no time to discuss this in detail, I think. But I just wanted to point out that blaming fisheries and fishermen for this is, especially in a country like India, doesn't really make sense, because even if that fisherman is catching some whatever amount of fish that you may think is unsustainable, that's probably having less of an impact than you or me buying one can of Coca-Cola also. If you look at it in terms of the impact on the ecology of broad ecosystems. So there's a lot of context that's missing when this overfishing topic gets brought up in public discussions. So, but I don't think we actually have the time to address that on this panel.
Risha?
Murli, if you want to add. Yeah.
I'll add mine last.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add, because Alyssa and Abhishek kind of covered it all. It is a very complex topic, and I think it's not the kind of thing that you can go to the extreme ends about. You can't say stop all fishing, ban fishing, and let's stop eating fish. Nor can you go to the other extreme and say let everything continue as it is and let things go the same way and eat fish as much as you want without a second thought. I think you need to educate yourself and have that moderation, but it's not just with fish. As Abhishek said, it's everything that you eat, everything that we do sadly today has an impact on the ecosystems, the environment. So the best thing is, actually figure out where your food is coming from, where your fish is coming from, and see if you can make better choices that can sort of help contribute towards this larger sustainability angle that we're all trying for. But it is a complex topic, and it's something that we all need to discuss a lot further. And it's something that I feel like a lot of us are spending all of our research trying to figure out. So there's no clear answer, really.
Yeah.
I think can I add one thing before you take this one?
Yes, please.
It's something that I love saying. Documentaries like Seaspiracy and Game Changer are designed for, from my understanding, the Western population. Being in India, to have conversations like, let's become vegan, stop eating this meat or stop eating that meat, doesn't really apply because we don't have industries to that scale. So the answer needs to be, think about what you are doing in your backyard as opposed to what's happening in the United States of America with any of these documentaries. Stop comparing yourselves to the Western world. We are not the Western world. We live life very differently. All yours, Murli.
Great point, Mariam. And I have saved the chat and I have recorded the video. So we'll figure out a way to get the rest of the questions across. But I think the one thing that I would like wrap it up and say is, if any documentary or any person gives you an extremely simple solution to such a complicated problem, he most probably is bluffing. If we could, or even, as in, seriously speaking, if everybody does stop eating fish tomorrow, obviously the systems would recover, but it would have impacts on the lives of several thousands of people across the world. So, as in, this is a classic example that I say is like a protected area system that we have, completely fortressed, is definitely going to keep whatever is inside is as safe as it can be. But we are also taking away the rights of what people had before of that area as well. So it's not a very simple solution. Like in the past, what we have always done is try to look for these simple solutions by saying the shark fishing industry is one great example in India, where arbitrarily sometime in between, our wildlife board decided that we will ban all shark species from fishing.
And rays.
With sharks and rays, without having an idea of what actually happens on ground in terms of landing, with the effects of bycatch, which is something that is caught by accident. The case still goes on for turtles and sea snakes as well. So a simple solution to a complex problem is going to create cascading problems of its own. I would imagine with a lot more people being interested in conservation and finding solutions, I would still be a lot more positive about what change we're going to see in 2045, about our choices and how the environment is going to be. More people are vocal and standing up to things that are going wrong. So I think there are solutions, and people are willing to look at more complicated and long-term solutions and not band-aid fixes to these things. So yeah, with that, I think great time. It's 5:30 exactly. We'll wrap it up. Thanks to all of you for coming. Suneha, do you have any finishing words?
No particular finishing words. I think, Murli, you said it perfectly well when saying if there's a very simple solution to a very complicated problem, either he's bluffing or he doesn't know what he's really talking about. So thank you all so much for coming here today. I profusely apologize for all these technical difficulties along the way. And thank you all for your patience and your questions. We have, Murli has saved the chat, and we'll work on getting all your questions answered, and we'll send them out over an email like we had communicated the meeting details to you all. And if you at any point would like to contact any of us separately, we will also, with the consent of our speakers, share our email IDs with you. So in case you want to get in touch with any of us for more detailed questions or discussions, please do feel free. So thank you all so much for coming here today, and huge thanks to all our speakers as well, and to Murli for taking over the moderation of the entire panel so effortlessly. Thank you all so much.
Suneha, just can I add one thing?
Yes,
those of you who are interested in looking deeper into this whole marine ecology course, last year a lot of universities, especially foreign universities, went online with their marine ecology and marine biology course lectures. You can find a whole range of them on YouTube from all several universities, and those are really, really good. So if you want to look deeper into things, you could check that out.
Yeah. Also, Coursera and edX are a good option. I'm sure you already know of that. But there are quite a few free courses on introductory marine megafauna and I think turtle biology and quite a few other large movement ecology, all of those things.
MIT is also offering a whole bunch of courses at the master's level, from ecology to anthropology to anything that you can think of. So there's a whole bunch of courses under the MIT website as well, which is free.
Okay, perfect. Trisha, do you have any last words for us? Any last places where people can collect further information beyond this?
Sorry, actually, I was just going to say that I can personally vouch for these courses because when I was in high school, I took some of these online ones myself, and that actually told me that, okay, this is what I want to do. So I would really strongly suggest that if someone's interested but a little confused, it's a good idea.
And it's also, I think, a great way to step into the field of marine ecology and conservation, because one of the hardest things is to decide what you want to work on. And the more you learn, the easier that decision will be. So please do take a look at all of these other resources that our speakers have highlighted. And we hope that this session was helpful to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. Shall we call it an evening?
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Nice talking
Bye,
to you
guys.
guys.
For having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was a lovely session.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.